He only needed a ride to get his sick son to the clinic. What he got was a chance at a new life. She only meant to help a stranger, but found someone who saw her for who she truly was, not what she owned. What began as a fleeting act of kindness would set two broken hearts on a path neither of them expected. If you believe that kindness can still change lives, and that love often arrives when we least expect, it makes sure to subscribe and stay with us through this unforgettable story. Because sometimes, a simple ride leads straight to the heart. The engine coughed twice, wheezed and gave up just like that. No dramatic smoke, no loud bang, just silence. Pierce gripped the steering wheel tighter as his old pickup rolled to a halt on the shoulder of Route 47, 40 miles from town, hemmed in by pine woods and a fast, darkening sky. In the passenger seat, Max gave a soft wheeze of his own. His small body curled under a flannel blanket, cheeks, pale forehead, dewy with sweat. 7 years old, and already fighting like a veteran against asthma that came in stealthy waves and sometimes refused to back down. Graham threw the door open and stepped into the icy wind. It slapped his face, yanked at his coat, and bit through the worn seams of his boots. He popped the hood and stared at the mess beneath, though he already knew he'd rebuilt this engine twice. It wasn't going anywhere tonight. He looked up the highway. Not a single car in sight, not even a flicker of headlights on the far curve. His phone had no bars, just like it hadn't for the last half hour. Inside the truck, Max gave a small cough. Graham flinched. He closed the hood and leaned against the rusted front fender, trying not to panic. But the fear was there, coiled low in his gut. Max needed to get to the urgent care clinic before his breathing worsened. In weather like this, even a slight delay could turn serious. Fast Graham wasn't a man easily shaken. He'd been through war zones, sat through nights of watching Lena, his wife, fade from a silent aneurysm, and learned to hold it together through every storm life threw his way. But something about tonight felt different. Lonelier and colder. He slid back into the cab and touched Max's cheek gently. Still warm, but clammy. The boy stirred, blinking through half-lidded eyes. "Dad, are we there yet?" Graham forced a smile. "Almost, buddy. Just taking a little break." Max nodded drowsily and turned his face toward the window, exhaling short, labored breaths. That's when the first pair of headlights appeared, cutting through the trees behind them like a miracle. Graham bolted upright. The SUV was sleek black, due completely out of place on this god-forsaken stretch of road. He stood by the truck and waved his arms. The SUV slowed. For a moment, Graham thought it would drive on, but then it rolled to a stop just ahead. The driver's window lowered, and the voice that floated out was calm, clear and female. "Are you okay?" Graham took a step forward. "My son's sick. We're trying to get to Oak Ridge, urgent care, but my truck just died." There was a pause. Then the passenger door unlocked with a click. "Get in, both of you." Graham hesitated because that's what men like him were trained to do. But Max gave a soft cough behind him, and that was all it took. He opened the passenger door and carefully carried Max from the truck. The woman had already adjusted the heat and reclined the back seat. As Graham buckled his son in, he finally took a moment to glance at the driver. She was striking early 30s, maybe with dark brown hair, swept into a low bun, and a gaze that held equal parts caution and intelligence. Her coat was expensive, her voice unshakably calm. She looked like someone who didn't belong anywhere near here, and yet here she was. "Thank you," Graham said as he climbed in. "Really?" The woman nodded. "Once I'm Evelyn, you're lucky I took the scenic route." Graham glanced at her. "I'm Graham, And this is Max. I can't thank you enough." Evelyn didn't reply. She just pulled back onto the road, eyes steady on the icy asphalt. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of the heater and Max's breathing now steadier. Then softly, Graham said, "You didn't even hesitate." "I did," Evelyn replied, but not for long. They drove in silence for a while. Then Max stirred his voice, groggy but certain. "You smell like Christmas trees." Evelyn smiled faintly. "That's the pine oil in the air. Freshener, I like it." Max mumbled, "You're nice." She didn't answer that. But when Graham turned to thank her again, he caught a glimpse of something in her expression. Some flicker of recognition or sadness as she watched Max in the rearview mirror, as if he reminded her of someone she used to know, or someone she used to be. They drove on. The heater inside the SUV blasted warm air that smelled faintly of cedar and something floral Graham couldn't quite name. He kept one hand gently on Max's chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing, while the other rested awkwardly on his knee. Across from him, Evelyn drove with the focused calm of someone used to being in control of her surroundings, of her time, and maybe even of people. But right now, she wasn't in control of the growing silence that wrapped around them like fog. "You live around here?" Graham finally asked. Breaking the tension, Evelyn kept her eyes on the road. "Not really. I was passing through on business. Some business that takes you through a stretch of highway with no cell reception." She smiled just enough to suggest amusement. "I take the long way sometimes. It helps me think." There was something about her voice, low, deliberate, like every word had been examined before leaving her lips. Graham could tell she wasn't the chatty type, but he also knew what it was like to keep things buried under layers of quiet. Max stirred in the back seat. "Is this car magic?" Evelyn glanced in the rearview mirror. "What makes you say that?" "Because it feels like I can breathe better in here," Max replied. Still groggy, Evelyn's face softened. "Well, that's good. We like breathing." Graham let out a low laugh, part relieved, part stunned by how natural this felt. His son was talking to a stranger like she was a school teacher or a fairy godmother. And somehow, this stranger was taking them straight into town without hesitation. "You didn't have to stop," he said after a while. "Most people don't." Evelyn was quiet, then replied simply, "Someone once stopped for me." Graham didn't push. It was the kind of answer that hinted at a story too painful or too precious to unpack with someone you just met. They passed a frozen field, moonlight glinting off the snow like crushed diamonds. Oak Ridge, the small town with the nearest urgent care clinic, was still 15 minutes away. Graham checked Max's breathing again. "Steady, thank God. I used to be a mechanic," he said, more to fill the silence than to impress. "Back when I could work full-time. Served in the Air Force, then settled here. Been a rough few years, but we're getting by." Evelyn said nothing, but he noticed her fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Sorry," he added quickly. "Didn't mean to drop my life story on you." "No," she said quietly. "It's fine. People don't talk enough." He turned to her, curious. "What kind of business are you in?" She hesitated just long enough to notice I work in finance. Graham raised an eyebrow. "Must be good work if you can afford this ride." Evelyn smiled again, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've done well, but money doesn't fix everything." That line sat between them like a loaded gun. Before he could ask more, Max coughed a dry barking sound that made Graham's heart leap. He turned around and gently rubbed his back. "Almost there, buddy," he murmured. Evelyn reached into the console and pulled out a small thermos. "It's herbal tea." "Safe. I haven't opened it." Graham hesitated, then took it. He unscrewed the lid, checked the steam, then gently helped Max take a sip. The boy leaned into him, comforted. "Thank you," Graham said. Again, Evelyn's voice was soft. "Don't thank me. Just take care of him." They reached Oak Ridge just after 7:40 p.m. The clinic's parking lot was nearly empty. Evelyn pulled up to the curb, put the SUV in park, and turned toward Graham. "I can wait," she offered. "No," Graham said, touched by the gesture. "You've done more than enough. Thank you for everything." He stepped out, then gently lifted Max from the back seat. Before closing the door, he looked at her. One last time. "Evelyn," he said, "I won't forget this." She nodded, and for the briefest second, something flickered in her expression, like she was trying not to let something rise to the surface. "Drive safe," he added, realizing too late she hadn't shared where she was headed. The door shut with a quiet finality. Evelyn watched them disappear through the clinic's automatic doors. She sat there for another 30 seconds, hands still on the wheel, eyes on the glass door that had closed behind them. Then, without another word, she shifted into drive and pulled away. And only after the SUV melted back into the night did Graham realize he didn't even know her last name. The clinic's waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old coffee. Graham sat hunched in a molded plastic chair, Max curled up asleep with his head on his father's lap, wrapped tightly in a hospital blanket. The worst of the episode had passed. The nurse said his oxygen was stable. Lungs clearer now, and there'd be no need for overnight care. Graham exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours, but the relief didn't bring peace. It never, did not fully. Behind the silence always was Lena. As Max slept, Graham's eyes wandered to the bulletin board on the wall, flyers for flu shots, grief counseling groups, veteran meetups. His gaze settled on one in particular: Resilience Through Loss Group, support for bereaved spouses. He looked away. The last time he'd sat in a place like this, Lena had been in the next room. They'd told him it was a routine scan. Nothing serious. 32 hours later, she was gone. A sudden aneurysm. No warning, no goodbye. She'd been baking cookies with Max the morning before. By the time Graham got the call, there wasn't even time to drive to the hospital before it was over. He still remembered the silence of that hospital hallway. The way no machine beeped, no shoes clicked, just a void that swallowed every plan they'd ever made. Daddy Max's voice pulled him back. Graham looked down. "Hey, buddy, are we going home now?" "Soon." "Just waiting for some paperwork." Max sat up, slowly blinking. His eyes were clearer, but still ringed with fatigue. "That lady in the car? Was she real?" Graham smiled faintly. "She was real. She helped us," Max said simply. "I think Mom sent her." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. Graham studied his son's face. Not naive, not trying to be sweet, just speaking truth the way children do. Unfiltered. He could have brushed it off, but he didn't, because deep down, something in him wanted to believe it too. Maybe she did, he whispered. Max leaned back into him, small and warm and brave. Mom used to say, "Kind people always find each other again." "Yeah," Graham murmured, pressing a hand over Max's heart. She did. A nurse called his name a few minutes later. Graham stood, lifted Max, and followed her to the desk. As he signed the discharge papers, his mind wandered back to Evelyn, the way her voice had wrapped gently around the silence in the car. The thermos of tea, the moment when she'd looked at Max like she recognized something in him. He hadn't asked for her last name. He hadn't asked anything, really, because some part of him had assumed it would end the moment the ride did. But the ache in his chest told him he'd been wrong. Later that night, after Max was asleep, Graham sat alone at the kitchen table. The house creaked softly in the cold. The ticking clock above the fridge marked time like a metronome. He poured himself a cup of reheated coffee and opened a worn photo album that lived on the top shelf untouched for months. there she was. Lena on the deck at Lake Crescent, laughing at something he couldn't remember. Holding Max at the hospital, her hair a mess, her eyes lit with joy, covered in flour, grinning during their first Thanksgiving as a family. She was vibrant in every photo hole. He traced a fingertip over the page. Would you have liked her? He murmured. This Evelyn, the question hung in the quiet kitchen, like the scent of old memories. He imagined Lena sitting across from him, rolling her eyes at his reluctance, teasing him about that serious mechanic face he always wore when emotions got too close. He leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. It wasn't just the gratitude that lingered after Evelyn's help. It was the way she didn't look away from the hard parts, the way she listened without rushing, and the way she never asked for anything in return. It reminded him of someone himself before loss hardened the edges. He stood slowly and walked to Max's bedroom. The boy slept soundly, one hand clutching a stuffed bear, his chest rising and falling steadily. Graham pulled the blanket up higher and paused. Max stirred. Again, the boy mumbled. Still half in a dream, Graham knelt beside the bed. What was that, champ? Max didn't answer, but a peaceful smile touched his face. Outside the window, the first flakes of snow had begun to fall soft as whispers. Graham watched them for a long time, heart steady but open. In a way it hadn't been in years. He didn't know if he'd ever see Evelyn again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was supposed to, that something had started, and if he didn't follow it, didn't at least try, he'd regret it. Somewhere deep inside where Lena's memory lived beside the best parts of him, he heard her voice. When someone brings you back to life, don't walk away. Evelyn Rhodes didn't cry easily, but that night after she pulled into the underground garage of her penthouse, the one she hadn't stepped foot in for over 2 months, she sat behind the wheel and just stayed. The engine hummed softly in the background, a low pulsing reminder that she could leave at any moment, but her hands didn't move, her eyes didn't blink. The image of the boy, Max, with his soft voice and searching eyes echoed in her memory. And Graham, the way he looked at his son, like every breath the boy took, was a thread tethering him to the earth. Evelyn had seen desperation before she'd negotiated billion-dollar mergers with men who'd sell their grandmothers for a 2-point uptick. But she hadn't seen that kind of quiet strength in a long, long time, the kind that asked for nothing and gave everything. She killed the engine. The silence was almost startling. Upstairs, the penthouse greeted her with cold glass and gleaming marble. The automated lights flicked on as she entered, casting sterile reflections across pristine floors. Everything was in its place. Untouched, lifeless. Evelyn toed off her heels and walked barefoot to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. Below, her Manhattan buzzed and blinked a glittering web of ambition and restlessness. It used to thrill her. She used to look at it and feel fire in her veins. Now, all she felt was distance. Her phone buzzed, a notification from her assistant. Your meeting with the Riedel Group is rescheduled to 9:30 a.m. Confirm. She stared at it for a long moment before typing a one-word reply. Cancel. She tossed the phone on the white leather couch and walked down the hallway to the only room that didn't look like a magazine, spread the study that had belonged to her father. The walls were still lined with his books, economic theory, market history, biographies of presidents and tycoons. He'd raised her on numbers, risk, models, discipline. But there was love there too, hidden beneath the analysis. She ran her fingers across the spines of his library, letting her hand rest on the small, brass handle of the bottom drawer. It was locked, always had been, tonight. She took the key from its place under the third book on the left, Wealth Without Guilt, and opened it. Inside was a single envelope yellowed with time, her name in his handwriting. To Evelyn, when you're ready to feel again. She sat cross-legged on the floor, still barefoot, and opened the letter with care. Money will protect you, but it will also trap you. You'll build walls so high no one will ever climb them. But one day, someone will come along who doesn't care how tall the walls are. Someone who sees past what you own and sees you. Don't push that person away. That's your real inheritance. Her chest tightened. Her father had been gone 5 years now. They'd barely spoken. In his final months, business had always gotten in the way, but here he was, as present as the wood grain under her fingers. She leaned back against the bookshelf, the letter still open in her lap. Graham hadn't asked a single question about what she did. Hadn't blinked when she offered help. He didn't try to impress her or figure her out. He just listened, held his son like he was made of light. And when she'd handed over that thermos, he hadn't looked at her like a savior. He'd looked at her like a person. And Max, that little boy, had stared at her with this quiet awe, not because of her wealth or beauty. He didn't even know those things. He looked at her like he recognized her, like they had met somewhere long ago in a better, gentler world. Kind people always find each other again. That's what the boy had said. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen without conditions, to matter, not because of her last name or her net worth, but because she chose for a moment to do something human. Maybe Lena had sent them, maybe not. But for the first time in years, Evelyn didn't feel like the one doing the saving. She felt saved. She stood up, slowly folded the letter and placed it back into the drawer. But before closing it, she took one last look at her father's handwriting, etched with certainty and care. Don't push that person away. The snow had started to fall over Manhattan. Light relentless, softening the hard edges of the skyline. And somewhere beneath it all, Evelyn knew Graham Pierce was no accident. It had been 5 days since the night on the highway. 5 days since Graham had watched the taillights of that black SUV disappear into the dark, like a half-remembered dream. And still, Evelyn lingered in his mind. Her voice, her eyes, her silence, that somehow spoke more than words. He hadn't told Max, but every day since the clinic visit, Graham had taken a different route home from his repair gigs, looping near the highway, in hopes of spotting her car again. Part of him knew it was foolish, but another part stronger believed in second chances. Not just in love, but in the unexpected kindnesses that life sometimes gives back when you least expect it. On Thursday morning after dropping Max off at school, Graham received a call from a local contractor about a short-term maintenance job at a facility on the edge of town. A manufacturing plant recently acquired by a holding company based in New York. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid decently, and he needed the hours. He drove out after lunch toolbox in the back of his truck. The building was modern and cold, with brushed metal siding and floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside the floor, manager handed him a visitor badge and a clipboard. The heating system was acting up, and there were some electrical inconsistencies in the maintenance wing. Graham signed in and made his way through the lower halls, reading schematics and tracing wiring junctions. It was quiet, sterile in the way new corporate buildings always were. Then a door opened at the far end of the corridor. He glanced up, and everything froze. Evelyn. She stepped out of an elevator in a tailored gray coat clipboard, in hand, flanked by 2 people in suits. Her hair was swept into the same low bun. Her stride was precise, but her face still held the softness he remembered from the passenger seat that night. She wasn't the woman who pulled over on the highway anymore. She was someone formidable. Their eyes met. Time buckled. She paused, mid-stride, dismissed her aides with a nod, and walked toward him alone. "Graham," she said, stopping just a few feet away. He lowered the clipboard slowly. "Evelyn, you work here?" she asked, voice perfectly calm. "Just for today. Heating issue." He smiled faintly. I own it." The words landed with the quiet weight of inevitability. There it was. No more guesswork. No more wondering. Evelyn Rhodes, the stranger who had pulled over on a desolate road, was no ordinary passerby. She wasn't a drifter or a kind-hearted local. She was a woman with power, with reach. A woman who didn't need to stop for anyone. And yet she had. He let out a soft exhale. "You didn't tell me you were this. You didn't ask." There was no accusation in her tone, only honesty. And in that moment, standing in a humming corridor of ductwork and motion sensors, Graham understood her in a way he hadn't before. They both smiled, awkward, cautious but real. "You saved us that night," he said softly. "No," she replied. "I just happened to be there. You've been saving him for years." He felt his chest tighten, the way she said it without fanfare, without sympathy. Like it was a truth she saw instantly. Silence lingered, but it wasn't empty. It was full of things not yet said, the kind of silence people earn by surviving enough life to know when words matter and when they don't. "Why didn't you say anything?" "We said I wasn't ready to be known," she said after a pause. "Not for what I have. I wanted to see if I could matter for something else." Graham nodded. He knew more than anyone what it meant to hide behind usefulness, to deflect attention from your real wounds. "And now I don't know," she said. "But when I saw you walk in today, I thought maybe fate's done waiting for me." He laughed quietly, incredulous. "I was just thinking the same thing." Overhead, a voice crackled over the intercom, calling for a technician on the second floor. Graham glanced down at his clipboard. "I should get to work," he said reluctantly. She smiled. "And I should pretend I'm not standing in a boiler hallway having a life moment." "You're good at that." "No," she said with a shrug. Terrible. Their eyes held for another breath, and in that single moment something shifted. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was possibility, the kind that didn't need permission to exist. Evelyn turned to go, her heels clicking softly down the corridor. And as Graham watched her disappear around the corner, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not certainty, not peace, but the quiet thrill of a door beginning to open. It was the smell of lavender that made Max pause. Not the artificial kind from air fresheners, but real lavender, like the sachets his mom used to keep in her sock drawer, the kind Graham had never quite brought himself to throw away. That's what drifted through the air. When Evelyn walked into the plant's break room 2 days later, Graham was pouring himself a lukewarm cup of coffee from the industrial pot, nursing a dull ache in his shoulder that never really left since his deployment. Max, off school for a teacher planning day, sat nearby with a sketch pad and a pack of crayons Graham had grabbed at the gas station that morning. He was coloring a lopsided drawing of a spaceship and a dog. He looked up when Evelyn entered and stared a moment longer than politeness allowed. "You smell like my mom," he said, as plainly as one might point out the weather. Evelyn blinked, caught mid-step. "Is that a good thing?" He nodded, with the solemn gravity only children can muster. She smelled like flowers and waffles, but mostly flowers. Graham froze, hand still on the coffee pot. His jaw tightened, eyes locked on the edge of the counter. Evelyn walked over and knelt beside Max. Then I'm honored Max studied her face with the kind of honesty only kids are brave enough to hold. "Are you going to help my dad again?" She smiled softly, cautiously. "Do you think he needs help?" Max shrugged, then nodded. "Everyone does. Even superheroes, the words hung in the air. They shouldn't have landed the way they did not. That gently, not that deeply, but somehow they went straight to the center of both adults. In the room, Graham cleared his throat louder than necessary. Max. But Evelyn raised a hand, her eyes never leaving the boys. He's not wrong. She stood slowly and turned to Graham. I actually came to check on the heating unit, but maybe I was hoping to run into my favorite field technician. Graham raised an eyebrow. Wasn't sure if I'd see you again. I wasn't sure either, she said, folding her arms though her voice stayed open. But here we are. Here we are, he echoed. There was a long pause. Neither of them moved. I was wondering. She said, after a beat, if I could take you both to lunch. Graham hesitated. He was many things. Mechanic, father, cautious, optimist. But lunch with someone like her felt like another planet. You don't have to. I know, she interrupted. But I'd like to. Max perked up clearly, aware something special was being negotiated. I vote yes, he said. Raising his hand like a miniature board member, Graham chuckled. I guess we've been outvoted. They ended up at a roadside diner, the kind with sun-faded booths, sticky syrup bottles, and waitresses who called you Han Max, ordered pancakes naturally, and poured syrup with surgical precision. Evelyn watched him, as if witnessing some private performance. Every flip of a crayon, every thoughtful pause between bites. Graham was watching her watch him. She didn't look out of place, not even for a second. That was the part that startled him most. She didn't try to dazzle or correct or steer the conversation. She just let it unfold. Your mom? Evelyn asked gently. Was she funny? Max nodded. She wore socks that didn't match and sang songs about toothpaste. Evelyn burst into laughter, bright and brief. She sounds like someone I would have liked. She was awesome, Max said, then went back to drawing a spaceship shaped suspiciously like a pancake. Graham swallowed against a lump rising in his throat. Yeah, he said, voice low. She was. They lingered long after the plates were cleared. Graham found himself talking more than he expected about Max's school, the workshop he tried to keep running part-time, the long days that turned into longer nights. Evelyn listened without interrupting her fingers, tracing circles on her coffee mug. Outside, the winter sun had melted most of the frost, leaving puddles that reflected light like broken mirrors. As they walked to the parking lot, Max tugged Evelyn's coat sleeve. If you marry my dad, can we still eat pancakes for dinner? Sometimes, Evelyn froze. Mid-step, Graham's face went crimson. Max shrugged. I just think she's good. Evelyn knelt again, her eyes level with his. Thank you, Max. That's the nicest thing anyone's said to me in a long time. She ruffled his hair gently and looked up at Graham. He was watching her with something cautious, something unspoken, something hopeful. They stood beside their cars, not ready to part, but not quite ready to stay. Either. I hope I see you again, Evelyn said. You will, Graham replied, surprising even himself with how certain he sounded. Evelyn smiled, but Max interrupted, tugging at his father's coat this time. Dad. Yeah, I think she's the one Mom told me about in my dreams. Graham didn't answer. He couldn't. He just turned back toward Evelyn, who had paused mid-step and found her watching them, sunlight catching in her eyes like something sacred. The next evening, Evelyn stood at the entrance of Graham's modest home, holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil and wondering what in the world she was doing. She had delivered keynote addresses to thousands. She had closed deals that shifted market tides. She had stared down boardrooms of billionaires without flinching. But now, standing in front of a small blue house with peeling shutters and wind chimes that twinkled softly in the dusk, she felt like a teenager bringing dinner to meet the parents. Before she could knock, the door swung open. Max stood there, grinning, his socks mismatched, and his hands sticky from what looked like a science project, gone rogue. "You came, I did," she said with a smile, lifting the dish. "And I come bearing lasagna." Max stepped back dramatically. "Food and mystery. You're the best kind of guest." Graham appeared behind him, sleeves rolled up, jeans dusty with sawdust. "That smells incredible." "Are you secretly a chef?" "I'm secretly a lot of things," Evelyn replied, stepping into the house. The warmth inside surprised her, not just the heat, but the feeling. It smelled of cinnamon and laundry detergent. The floor creaked a little. A guitar leaned against the wall, and on a shelf by the window, a parade of Max's school projects stood proudly: crooked ceramic mugs, glitter-covered animals, a paper crown that read, "Science King." She set the lasagna on the counter and turned to find Graham watching her. Not like someone impressed, but like someone taking inventory of what mattered. "Thank you," he said. "Least I could do," she replied, brushing her hair behind her ear. Dinner was noisy in the best way. Max insisted on setting the table, dropped a fork, blamed it on the dog they didn't have, and launched into a detailed monologue about prehistoric reptiles and why stegosauruses were the underdogs of the dinosaur world. Evelyn laughed more that night than she had in months. She shared fragments of her life. Connecticut upbringing, a father who thought feelings were best filed away, summers spent in libraries instead of beaches. She skipped the penthouse, the portfolio, the pressure. She gave them Evelyn, not the CEO. Graham offered his own pieces in return. The Air Force, Lena, a used bookstore where they met, the birth of Max, and how that one moment redefined his entire purpose. There was no pretense, no agendas, just two people and a boy sitting around a wobbly table swapping warmth. After dinner, Max insisted on showing Evelyn his drawing collection and giving her a full tour of the backyard through the back window. "That's the tree I fell out of twice. That's where Dad burned the burgers." Finally, he yawned so wide his whole head tilted. "Bed," Graham said. Rising, "Say goodnight." Max walked up to Evelyn and hugged her around the waist. "Good night. Pretend you're staying forever." She blinked down at him, caught completely off guard. "I'll try," she whispered, brushing a kiss to his hair. Once Max was tucked in, the house quieted. Graham returned with 2 mugs of tea. They stood in the kitchen, leaning on opposite counters, steam rising between them. "I've been alone a long time," he said, suddenly, not looking at her. Evelyn didn't answer right away. "Me too. But alone in a crowd. That's worse." He nodded. "Yeah, it is, outside." Snow had begun to fall again, soft, slow, steady. It layered over the world like a clean slate. Inside, the silence between them changed. It wasn't empty. It was earned. "You know," she said, her voice gentle, "it's strange. I don't even know what you really think of me." Graham looked up. "I think," he said slowly, "you pulled over for 2 strangers and didn't ask for anything in return. That tells me more than most people do in a lifetime." Her eyes softened. "That wasn't hard to do." "It's rare," he said. Even now, a long moment passed. Neither moved. "I don't know what this is," Evelyn admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want it to be over. It doesn't have to be." She took a breath, as if steadying herself. "I'm not good at." This, Graham smiled, stepping a little closer. "Neither am I. But maybe we don't have to be good. Maybe we just have to be real." Their eyes locked. The electricity between them wasn't the loud kind. It was quiet, built on small things. Shared silences, unspoken grief, and unexpected comfort. He didn't reach for her. He didn't have to. Because sometimes connection doesn't begin with a kiss. It begins in a kitchen filled with mismatched mugs under a ceiling where laughter still echoes, and across from someone who sees through everything you've built and still stays. The following Monday started like any other cold-wind black coffee, and Max, in a half-buttoned jacket with one shoe mysteriously missing again. Graham dropped him at school with a smile and a high five, then headed across town to the manufacturing plant for another day of boiler checks and panel rewiring. What he didn't know was that Evelyn would be there too. She'd flown back in late the night before, canceling her Monday meetings in New York without explanation. Her assistant didn't ask any more, just reshuffled the calendar. Evelyn had stopped living for quarterly reports. She had started showing up where it mattered, and today it mattered. At 10:14 a.m., everything changed. Graham was deep in the lower mechanical wing, elbow deep in an access panel when he heard it, a low, vibrating thump that rattled the floor. He paused, then came the second sound, sharper, angrier. The overhead lights flickered. A third thud. Then silence. Then the alarm screamed. Red strobes pulsed across the concrete walls. A high-pitched siren split the air. Smoke, thick, acrid electric, began curling under the hallway door. Graham didn't hesitate. He dropped the wrench and ran. 2 floors up. Evelyn was mid-conversation with a team lead when the klaxon blared. Around her, people scrambled papers, coats, voices. She looked toward the stairwell, then paused. Her gut said, "Run." But something deeper, something older, pulled her the other way. She didn't ask why. She just went down. Not up, back in the lower hall. Graham shoved through a jammed fire door and found 2 employees staggering through haze. He threw an arm around one, guided them toward the emergency exit. His lungs burned. The smoke clawed at his throat. He kept moving. Then just beyond the orange glow, he saw her, Evelyn. She was coughing, her eyes red and wild, but she was there. "What are you doing here?" he shouted, grabbing her arm. "I could ask you the same thing," she choked. "You're supposed to be upstairs. I was looking for." She cut off as a child's scream pierced the air. They both froze. The school tour, Evelyn gasped. There were kids on a site visit today. Graham turned toward the sound and ran down the hallway. Past the thickening smoke, he dropped low, guiding himself by instinct, sound, and military muscle memory. He counted doors, stayed low, covered his face. Evelyn followed her blazer, long gone, sleeves rolled up, a fire alarm still blaring behind them, like a warning from God. They found them, 4 children huddled under a metal staircase, eyes wide and tear-streaked. The chaperone lay unconscious beside them. Graham moved without thinking. He hoisted the woman over his shoulder, gestured for Evelyn to take the hand of the youngest girl. "Follow me. Keep low. Don't stop." The hallway behind them groaned an awful metallic warning. Then it collapsed. A support beam fell with a crack, like thunder bursting through the ceiling and sending a cloud of debris down between Graham and Evelyn. She screamed his name. Flames licked up the walls. Sparks cascaded like shooting stars. Smoke swallowed her vision. Graham, no response. She dropped to her knees, searching her heart, slamming like a fist in her chest. There was nothing but heat and chaos, and the awful absence of sound where he should have been. Then movement. A shape emerged through the haze. Graham, carrying the last child, staggering, blood trickling down his temple. His shirt was half burned, and his face was black with soot, but he was upright, he was breathing, and he was still moving forward. He handed the boy into Evelyn's arms before sinking to one knee. She caught him, cradling him as if he were the only thing in the world. "You went back," she whispered, tears streaking her ash-covered cheeks. "Someone had to," he rasped, coughing. "You didn't know I was here." He blinked at her. Didn't matter. Evelyn held him tighter, as if by sheer force of will she could keep him safe. And in that moment, surrounded by fire and ruin, she cried. Not because she was afraid, but because for the first time in her life, someone had run into the danger for her. Not for what she had, not for what she could offer, but simply because it was right. And he didn't even know she was watching. Graham woke to beeping. Soft, rhythmic clean. He blinked at the fluorescent light above eyes burning from dryness. The scent of antiseptic and plastic hit, first followed by the dull, throbbing ache in his ribs and a weight along his right temple. His lungs felt like they'd been scraped raw. He was alive. Turning his head sent pain flaring down his neck, but he managed. On the chair beside him, slouched, but alert, sat Evelyn. Her hair was tied back. The loose strands had come undone and clung to her cheeks. There were smudges beneath her eyes, the kind that come from being awake too long and worrying too hard. "You stayed," he rasped. She looked up. Her tired smile could have lit a room. "Of course I did. How long? 14 hours, she said. "You were unconscious most of it. They had to sedate you after you started coughing. Blood. Smoke inhalation. Mild concussion. Couple of cracked ribs. Sounds like I lost the fight." "No," she said, brushing a piece of lint off the blanket. "You won just barely." He let out a slow breath. The pain was sharp, but tolerable. "The kid's all safe. So is their teacher. You pulled them all out." He closed his eyes. Good Evelyn hesitated, then leaned closer. "You could have died." He didn't answer. She took his hand. "But you didn't. You went back. You ran into that building like someone who had nothing to lose." "I didn't think," he said. "There wasn't time." "Yes, there was," she said gently. "You had a choice, and you made it." He looked at her. "I couldn't have left them, I know." A pause. "But you didn't know I was there," she said quietly. "Not when the beam fell. Not when the fire started." He frowned. "No, I didn't." Her hand tightened around his. "But you still ran toward the danger. That's what shook me." Why, she looked away, blinking. "Because no one's ever done something for me without wanting something in return. Not once. Not until you." He blinked at her, unsure how to carry the weight of that. "I don't have much," he said softly. "You have more than most." Another beat of silence passed between them, fragile and full. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something folded, creased but carefully handled a newspaper. On the front page was a photo of fire trucks lined outside the manufacturing plant, smoke curling into the sky, and beside it, smaller but unmistakable, a headshot of her. The headline read, "Rhodes Holdings, CEO involved in plant fire rescue." He stared at it. Slowly, he pieced it together. He looked at her again. "You're Rhodes," he said. She nodded. "The Rhodes. As in?" "Yes." He looked at the photo again. "You were the one who bought the plant. You were there that day, before the alarms. You walked through like it was yours." "It is." He sat back slowly against the pillows. "You didn't tell me. I didn't want you to know," she said. "Not like that. I wanted to be someone else for a while, just Evelyn." He took that in. "That's who you've been," she smiled faintly. "You don't feel misled?" "No," he said and meant it. "You didn't lie. You just waited." She looked down. "I've lived most of my life in glass towers. People see me through headlines and spreadsheets. I wanted someone to see the part of me that has nothing to do with boardrooms or mergers. And I did." "You did," she said, her voice breaking. He reached for her hand again and squeezed. You were the woman who stopped on the highway. The one who poured tea for my sick son and waited in a parking lot without needing to be asked. That's who you are to me. She nodded, tears brimming. Graham exhaled slowly. Max was right, you know. She wiped at her eye. About what he said his mom sent you. Her breath caught. Do you believe that he looked out the hospital window? Snow was falling again, soft flakes just like the night they met. I think he said some people show up exactly when they're meant to. Maybe that's all the proof I need. Evelyn didn't respond. She just leaned in, rested her forehead gently against his, and let the quiet between them say everything else. Graham stood in the middle of his garage workshop. The door rolled halfway open to let in the late afternoon sun. The scent of sawdust and motor oil hung in the air, mingling with the subtle burn of freshly sanded cedar. He exhaled slowly, the rhythm of his breath matching the gentle scrape of sandpaper against wood. He wasn't building a chair or a table, or even something practical. He was building a plane, a wooden glider simple in shape carved from the same cedar he'd once used to make Max's first toy car. But this one wasn't for Max. Not entirely. It was for her, for Evelyn. She hadn't left his side in the days after the fire, not when the pain hit, not when the cameras showed up, not when the press tried to turn him into something he wasn't. She didn't parade him around. She didn't need to say, I care. She just stayed. Quiet, present, steady. She hadn't said the word love. She hadn't needed to. He sanded the wing one last time and set it into place. It clicked softly into the body, snug, smooth. On the underside, he had burned a message into the grain with his old wood pen, for the one who made me fly again. A moment later, Max came bounding into the garage, cheeks red from the chill and holding an envelope in both hands. It's from her, he said, breathless. There's a letter and a fancy invite thing. Graham wiped his hands, took the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note on cream stationery. Graham, tomorrow, we open the new wing at the plant rebuilt, renamed, and dedicated to the people who ran toward the fire. I want you and Max to be there. Not as guests, as family. Beneath the note was a formal printed invitation bearing the new name of the facility, the Pierce Innovation Wing. Graham sat down, staring at the words. For a moment he couldn't breathe. He hadn't asked for recognition, hadn't wanted a plaque or a podium. But this wasn't for applause. It was legacy. It was her way of saying, you mattered. You still do. The next morning, beneath a crisp October sky, Graham stood in front of the facility with Max beside him. Reporters buzzed in the distance, clicking cameras and scribbling notes. Employees lined the front steps. A new metal sign gleamed in the sun. Pierce Innovation Wing. Evelyn stood at the podium in a navy coat, her hair pinned back, wind brushing strands across her face. She looked different from the Evelyn he'd met that night on the highway, not because she was more polished, but because she looked free. She spoke slowly, her voice clear. Today, we don't just reopen a building, she began. We reopen a promise that what we build here together will be driven by courage, by community, and by kindness. Graham felt Max's hand slide into his. The boy squeezed gently. Evelyn continued. This facility will not carry my name. It carries the name of a man who reminded me what it means to show up, who taught me that heroism is not loud or proud. It's quiet. It's the man who checks on the furnace when no one else will. The man who holds a child with both arms, even when his own are shaking. The man who walks through fire, not because he's unafraid, but because someone else needs him more. She paused, and I want to call him to the stage. A hush fell over the crowd. Graham didn't move. Max tugged at his sleeve. You got this. Dad, Slowly, he stepped forward. Every limb felt heavy. He'd stood in front of troops before he'd spoken at Lena's memorial. But this was different. When he reached the podium, Evelyn didn't step aside. She slipped her hand into his, and for a long moment, they stood side by side, facing the crowd, facing the cameras, facing whatever came next. Then she leaned toward him and whispered, so only he could hear, "This is only the beginning." He looked at her, at the way the wind caught the corner of her smile, and something in his chest settled quiet and sure. He hadn't just survived, he had arrived. Winter settled in quietly that year. The first snow came early in December, blanketing the streets of Oak Ridge, in a hush that softened everything. Footsteps, voices, even memories. Graham stood on the front porch, with Max, their breath visible in the morning air. The wooden railing was covered in frost, and tiny icicles clung to the roof's edge like ornaments waiting for Christmas. Inside, the kettle whistled, and behind them, Evelyn hummed as she set the table for three. The house had changed, not in its structure, but in its atmosphere. There was a lightness now. A rhythm, the kind that comes not from grand declarations, but from the everyday accumulation of presence. There were 2 coffee mugs on the counter each morning, a second toothbrush in the bathroom, a book on the armrest, where only tools had sat for years. Evelyn had moved in gradually, as if not to disturb the foundation, but rather to blend with it, drawer by drawer, gesture by gesture. No one had spoken of permanence, and yet permanence was everywhere. That morning, Max handed Graham a folded paper heart. "It's for her," he said, rubbing his mittened hands together. "But you should read it first." Graham opened it and found 6 words written in crooked, determined handwriting. "You're who Mom was waiting for." He didn't speak, just nodded and folded the paper carefully, like something sacred, then slipped it into his jacket pocket near his heart. Later that night, after Max had gone to bed and the fire was a soft flicker in the hearth, Evelyn curled on the couch with a blanket over her legs and a book in her lap, unread, her eyes distant. Graham walked in from the workshop, something in his hands. "I never said." "Thank you," he began. "For the plant, for the name, for everything." "You don't have to, I do." He held out the gift. It was the wooden plane he'd been carving, the one he'd sanded and shaped over weeks. The cedar glowed in the firelight. It was simple, elegant, unvarnished, much like him. She turned it over, and under the wing, in careful hand-burned letters, she read, "For the one who made me fly again." Her throat tightened. "Graham." He sat beside her. "I didn't know if you'd want it. I thought maybe it was too much or not enough, or—" She stopped him with a look. "I want it," she said softly. "And I want something else, too." He raised an eyebrow. She stood, letting the blanket fall to the floor, walked a few steps, then turned around. "Marry me." Graham blinked. "Wait! You're proposing!" "Yes," she said, smile playing at the corners. "I've spent my life being expected to wait for men to take the lead. But I don't want to wait." "I already know." He stood too. "Don't I have to get on one knee?" "No," she said. "I do," and she did, right there beside the fire in the home that grief had once hollowed out and love had slowly rebuilt. Evelyn Rhodes, the woman who had once ruled Wall Street with sealed lips and sleepless nights, knelt in socks and a sweater and asked a man with calloused hands and a quiet heart to be hers. He knelt too, took her hands gently in his. "I would have asked," he whispered. "I just didn't know if I could give you enough." She smiled through tears. "You already did." In the weeks that followed, they made no big announcements, no flashy engagement photos, just a note to friends, a dinner with close neighbors, and one very excited boy who told anyone who would listen. My dad's marrying the lady who smells like flowers and saves factories. They didn't choose a grand venue. They married on New Year's Eve in the backyard, under falling snow, surrounded by people who knew what loss felt like, and knew how precious new beginnings were. Graham wore a charcoal suit that still smelled faintly of cedar. Evelyn wore a simple white coat and a smile that made every breath of winter feel like spring. Max stood proudly between them, holding the wooden plane. And when the officiant asked for vows, Graham didn't speak right away. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded heart Max had given him weeks before, and held it up. "This," he said, "says everything I could. Everything she would have wanted me to say." Evelyn nodded, her eyes brimming. Then the three of them, man, woman, child, stood in the snow and began again. Not because they forgot what they lost, but because they finally remembered what love could build in its place. Where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to know. Drop a comment below, and let's connect across the miles. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to our channel. It's the kindness and support from viewers like you that keeps these stories alive. Thank you for spending time with us today. We hope this story left you with a little more warmth and a little more faith in love. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.